Well, good evening, everyone. I'm David Madison. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, and I'm joined this evening by our Director of Professional Development, Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, good evening. Oh, Mary Catherine, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sure everyone would like me to be muted, but alas, now I'm back. Good evening, everyone.
Well, welcome to everyone joining us this evening. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, there are two different ways to communicate with us. First is the Q&A box. So if you see a button towards the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, if you'll go and push on the Q&A button, a Q&A box will pop up. That's going to be the best way to send us questions throughout our time this evening. One of the nice things about the live webinars, one of the best things about it is that we can answer questions as they come up as we're reviewing the materials. So let's give that Q&A box a trial run. If you will open the Q&A box and if you'll type in your home city and send that in as a question, that will let us know that the Q&A box is working. So if you would do that right now, we would appreciate it. Tell us what city you are appearing from, and that is working well. We've got Phoenix, Nacogdoches, Edinburgh, we've got different cities presented. So welcome to everybody. Another function, just so that you know it's out there, is the chat function. So if you click on chat, or it may be under more, towards the right, there's a button that says more with 3 dots. If you click on that, it'll open up a chat window. And if you want to communicate with other participants, if you have other resources you want to share or other questions you want to send out, feel free to use the chat function as well. Either of those ways are great ways to send questions to us. And one of the things we're going to make sure we do tonight is have all of your questions answered about strategic planning. So whether you want to use the Q&A box, whether you want to use the chat box, either way, make sure that you send those questions in and don't lose any. As soon as they pop into your head, put them in the Q&A box or put them in the chat box. So we'll make sure to be able to circle back around and get all your questions answered this evening. One other bit of housekeeping before we get started, and that is that a recording of the webinar this evening will be available to you. It'll be available on our website in the webinar library. If you do not have login credentials for our website, if you'll contact our office, we'll make sure you have those. But that's a great way to go back and review this or any other webinar we've offered. If you want to go back, take a look, or maybe share that with other members of your community. Our webinars are always available in the webinar library found on our website. And again, don't hesitate to let us know if you're having a difficult time accessing the website, and we will make sure that you have the ability to do that. So let's just dive right in. And again, the topic this evening is strategic planning. And so a couple of different things I'd like to cover this evening. First, I'd like to talk about the role of the board. Where does the Board of Trustees play into this process compared to the head of school or the rest of the staff of the school? I'd also like to outline a strategic planning process. Now, this is not the only strategic planning process, but I do want to share one outline with you in the event you would like to start putting together a strategic planning process for your school. Then I want to share a handful of different resources for some additional work. These are resources that you can use as you're putting your strategic planning process together. And then finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. So any questions you have about the topic, we'll make sure to get those addressed. So let's just dive right in, and let's start with the role of the Board of Trustees. So this slide is from the NAIS Trustees Handbook. And I use this slide a lot in board training, where we talk about what falls under the board's purview, what falls under the head's purview, what's shared, how do we figure out how this shared leadership between head and board is operationalized. This chart's really helpful. And so what we talk about is lanes and making sure that everyone understands which lane they belong in, and how do we respond when we get outside of our lane and then into another lane. What do we do? So the reason I want to share this slide is that what we're talking about this evening is in that top lane. It's under policies and strategies. So the strategic planning process really is a board function. Now, that being said, you will see that it says board decision, but with the head of school's advice. The head of school has got to be plugged into this process from the beginning. The head of school is going to be an integral part in the development of the strategic plan and also in the execution of the strategic plan. So it definitely is a board responsibility, but it's a board responsibility that is going to rely upon the executive of the school or the head of school. Another way to look at this is through a book called Governance is Leadership, which I also use with board training. And in that top lane, that board lane, Richard Chait says another way to look at it is that the board is responsible for fiduciary work, strategic work, and generative work. So the strategic work of a board is coming up with the process to create that strategic plan, making sure the school has the resources to execute on the strategic plan. And that's really what we're talking about this evening. So that's another way to look at why this function of strategic planning is definitely a board responsibility, but it still has to be done in very close concert with the head of school. So let's look at the planning process. So what does a planning process look like if you are ready to start a new strategic plan? Where do you begin that process? So I'd like to start by sharing a quote that I think makes a lot of sense to me. This is from a woman named Stephanie Rogan. Mary Catherine and I have taken a look at a lot of Stephanie's material. She's from a group called the Greenwich Leadership Partners. And they do a lot of great work with private schools across the country. But her take on strategic planning is this: too often strategic planning doesn't engage community members in deep reflection about the purpose of the school or the experience of the students. In her book, which I'll give you the full citation for later, she talks about the difference between strategy and then just planning for business as usual. And what we really want to do is dip our toes into strategy. And if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we engage the full community in some very deep reflection about mission, about what we feel is important, why we're doing the things we're doing, and how this affects the day-to-day experience of the student. So I like that quote. I think it just sets the stage for kind of reminding us what we're trying to do. What we're not trying to do is just create either a wish list that we're not sure how we're going to get there, or just a plan for us to continue operation as usual. We're not trying to accomplish that. Rather, we're really trying to get into the deep, rich work of digging into what our mission is, how we accomplish our mission, and what that looks like on a day-to-day experiential level with the student. So that takes us to the next question. If we're really trying to engage the community in that deep work, who should be involved in the planning process? And what does appropriate involvement look like that will get us that high level of engagement? So 3 different things I'd like for you to consider about this. First, we recommend the creation of a strategic planning task force. Now, this sometimes is a standing committee of the board. Sometimes it's a group of just the officers, the executive council of the board. Sometimes it's not a standing committee, but it's an ad hoc committee. However the board structures that, this is going to be the small group that's really tasked with designing the process, crafting the plan, and then making sure the plan's adopted by the board and then executed. So the frequently asked questions that pop up on this with this group is, how many people? How many people should it be? Well, there's not a magic number for that. What we normally like to see is somewhere in the 6 to 8 people range, not because that's a magic number, but because if you get fewer than 6, you're going to have a hard time having enough horsepower to get everything done. If you get more than 8, 9, 10, scheduling becomes a real nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mary Catherine, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm just thinking about just, the whole concept around a committee that's that big it's hard to get anything done because everyone, just from scheduling or just really from trying to get all the perspectives to come to consensus on the process. So I like the 6 to 8 number a lot.
And it just seems to be that seems to be a manageable size. Other frequently asked questions are, should there be a faculty member on the strategic planning task force? Perhaps. Sometimes I've seen that be all board members. Sometimes I've seen it be board members along with some other stakeholders, maybe former board members or vestry people. I've also seen sometimes there's a faculty representative on the strategic planning task force. So it's a function of the board. You have to be a little bit sensitive to that. But do you have an opinion one way or the other about whether or not a faculty member should serve on the strategic planning task force?
I sort of like the idea of that, because I think I think if you don't have a faculty member, it feels like that there's not anyone representing that constituency.
Right.
Of course, I think it needs to be a leader in the faculty. I think it needs to be someone who understands the process and sees the bigger picture, because I don't think it needs to be the person that's representing the faculty for, kind of with an agenda. I think
Sure.
It needs to be somebody who understands the process. But yeah, I like the idea. I always had a faculty member on our committee, just because I think it needs to be somebody who represents that constituency.
Yeah, again, if we're going into that, trying to yield that high level of engagement, that would be the lens that I would use to answer that question and try to figure out, it may make sense to have a faculty member on that group, because not having a faculty member on that group could affect that high level of engagement from all the stakeholders. We'll talk about some other options if the decision is made not to have a faculty member on that committee, because I've seen that as well. And then we've got to just be intentional about other ways to get faculty members plugged into the process. But that's
Right.
the first group, the strategic planning task force. The next group is the strategic planning retreat participants. So when we get into the nuts and bolts of what this process looks like, you're going to see reference to a retreat that involves a wider group of stakeholders. So that tends to be, it depends on the size of the community to some extent, but that tends to be 15, 20, 25, I've seen as large as 30 different stakeholders that come together and participate in an event that's been crafted by that strategic planning task force to get all the information they'll need to move forward to craft the plan. And we'll talk about the retreat in a moment, but that's the second discrete group that I would consider. Again, I've seen this, all the boards should be participating in this.
Right.
Former board members, I've seen sometimes parents involved in this. I've seen faculty members involved in this, donors to the school sometimes participating.
I was going to say something about the community members who might have been involved in the history of the school. We asked some people to do that, and it really brought a new perspective. Alumni, people who are involved in not only the community of your school, they've been involved in your school, but they're also involved in the greater community in which you live, which helps, I think.
I think alumni, gold mine. I think former parents can be a gold mine too.
Yes, for sure.
Just because they, some former parents tend to frankly be your loudest advocates, and
Right.
they're vested, but not personally vested in some of the, some of the things that sometimes will get a strategic planning process caught up, getting too involved in the minutia. Former parents are great because they've got a little bit of perspective, but they also love the place because they've seen the success of the program through their kids. So those are things to think about with regard to who to invite to the strategic planning retreat. And then, of course, I have as a third group, everyone. I've got a question mark on that, because the point here is that everyone should have the ability to get plugged into this process somehow, but everyone won't be plugged in at the same level, if that makes sense. So this is why doing a constituency survey that everyone gets to complete, so all faculty, all parents, that's a way to make sure that all of your community at least have some way to get plugged in. The reality is we just don't have the size of a space and the ability to have every single parent into the strategic planning retreat, or every single faculty member into the strategic planning retreat. Depending on the size of your community, you may be able to do that, but more often than not, that's not possible. So then you just want to think about, okay, the folks that aren't on the strategic planning task force, the folks that maybe aren't going to participate in the strategic planning retreat, how can I get those folks plugged in? Just have that in the back of your head as you're designing your process, because there are ways to do that. And we'll highlight a few more as we go through our presentation this evening. But just be thinking, again, yielding the highest level of engagement. That's our goal. So there should be some way for everyone to get plugged into the process. So let's dive into the nuts and bolts of what the process should look like. And I've divided it into different steps. Each of these steps will look a little bit different depending on your design, but let me go through each of the steps and kind of throw some thoughts out, and then make sure to ask questions if you have any questions about any of these steps. So step one really is preparing to launch, and that's purely the board's step. So what does this consist of? Well, first, assess the mission statement. So more often than not, you're not going to have a huge amount of work to do on your mission statement, but it does make sense to ask the question, is our current mission statement an accurate representation of our mission? Mission statements shift. Mission statements should shift, and the language should reflect where the school is and what its goals are. And as a result, the mission statement that the school put together in 1974 may or may not be the best mission statement or be the best articulation of the school's mission. So it does make sense for the board, before they launch into this process, to really just check around the room to make sure we're comfortable with our mission statement. If there's consensus that we need to work on the mission statement, I would recommend that work happens before we launch into further steps of the strategic planning process. We're going to work off the assumption that you've checked in with your mission statement, everyone's comfortable with the mission statement as it's written. The next question to ask is timing. So there's lots of things going on in the life of the school, but is this the right time for a strategic plan? So the questions to ask to answer that point would be, well, when was the last plan launched? Are we, is it time for a new plan? What about the accreditation cycle? Because we're going to get a lot of data from the accreditation self-study and visit. So when was the last accreditation visit? Is there an accreditation visit coming up? You should have a conversation about that. Once that's all been done and everyone agrees that this is the right time, the next step is to select that strategic planning task force and identify the chair. That will be the group that is going to plan or design the process, and then will ultimately craft the plan and then bring the plan to the board for adoption. Also, the board should establish the timeline and the budget. What's your budget going to be? Part of that's going to depend on whether or not you're going to facilitate internally. Are you going to bring in a facilitator to do some of this work for you? Are you going to bring in a facilitator to do some of this work for you and to also physically draft the plan? The facilitation plan, there's not a one size fits all. It depends on how much outside help you want, if any, and what your budget is for that. But that conversation should be had on the front end before you get too much further along, because those are questions you need to answer before the task force really starts putting its plan together. So we've created the task force, we have the facilitation plan in place, we know what our budget is. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is to collect data. So what type of information is needed to inform the strategic design process? I would recommend 3 different baskets of information that you need to at least have something from all of these baskets in order to have enough information to proceed with developing your strategic plan. The first is industry trends. So a board needs to be up to date on what's going on in our industry. What I mean by that is, what are the enrollment trends? What's going on with the economy? What about the world of philanthropy? What do we need to know about fundraising? What's going on from teaching and pedagogy? What do our kids need to be experiencing in our schools now to be successful down the road? So do we as a board understand that? And then competition. There is a nonstop list of competing schools, different types of schools, that's not going to change. You're always going to have competition. It probably is going to get even more competitive as time goes by. So it's really important to understand what the landscape is so that you'll be able to strategically highlight the things that make you different and distinctive. So industry trends, make sure that you've got data collected on industry trends. A couple of suggestions of how to do that. We'll offer a trends webinar that you can take. Also the NAIS trend book. That's a publication that's published every year by the National Association of Independent Schools. And it does a great job of looking at all of the different data points on all of these areas. It's a quick read, and it's a really great way to get up to speed on all of the trends in the independent school industry. So that's industry trends. The next basket of information or data that you need would be what I would call an institutional review. So this is data that shows us how are we doing as a school. So things like the accreditation report. Every time a school goes through an accreditation process, they receive an on-site visit report that is full of commendations, which are identified things that the school is doing a great job on, and recommendations, which are areas of improvement. So if you've got a recent accreditation report, there may be some really good information in there that already highlights some things that the school needs to work on. So don't reinvent the wheel. If you've got a recent on-site visit report, get your hands on that and take a look at it. We talk about financial dashboards. So do we understand how we have been performing financially over the past 5 or ideally 10 years? How are we doing? Are we generating a surplus every year? Have we been running at a deficit every year? What are some of the things that Mary Catherine and I talked about on our dashboard seminar when we look at things like cost of, what's the student cost? What's it cost per kiddo to run our school compared to what we charge in tuition? All of those different financial metrics that will give you an idea of how you're performing financially as a school. Enrollment data, that's extremely important because it will show what are the trends in your enrollment. Are you generally getting larger? Are you generally shrinking? Are there areas of softness in the enrollment report? So for example, are there certain grades that, wow, we've got a dip there. We need to plan for that because that dip, we're going to be feeling that dip for the next 4 or 5 years until that dip graduates. So what does that look like? All of those things. A SWOT analysis, that's a fancy way of just saying what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are our opportunities, and what are our threats. So the strengths and the weaknesses focus on what's going on internally with the school, and the opportunities and threats force us to kind of survey the landscape. What's going on in our community that could be an opportunity we want to take advantage of, or a threat that we need to be aware of. And then finally, benchmark. So however you want to benchmark, we recommend you use either the SAES vital signs. That's available on our website, and it goes through a variety of different things that high performing schools all share. For example, we find that high performing schools have faculty salaries that are in the 85 to 90% range of the local ISD salaries. We find that's necessary in order to attract and retain the best faculty. We don't have to pay dollar for dollar necessarily because a lot of teachers prefer teaching in our environments compared to the public school environments. However, if that gap between what they're paying and what we're paying gets a lot larger than 15%, what we have found is it's hard to retain faculty. It's hard to attract new faculty. Mary Catherine, did you want to make a comment about that? Because I know you're passionate about that particular benchmark.
Well, I am, and that's something that I feel like that we should always take a look at when we're doing strategic planning, because it's something that we're all most schools struggle with, and especially the smaller schools are struggling with that particular thing. So I think it's definitely something that needs to be on that institutional review. We did have a question from about is the financial dashboard webinar available on the website? And yes, that is available. It's a 2-hour webinar.
It is. So Travis, it is available. The one thing that's different about that webinar is the 2-hour webinars, it's $99 per school to access those. So you absolutely can access that, but that's not included in your membership fee. So email me if you'd like some more information about that, because our multi-hour webinars, they're a little bit different from the 1-hour webinars that we do, if that makes sense. But Travis, if you'll email me, I'll get with you and kind of tell you more about that financial dashboard, and can walk you through some of the different things that we think are really, really important. And then based on that conversation, you may want to either sign up for the next time we do that live, or access the recording, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, and I think back to the institutional review, I think that financial dashboard, I cannot stress enough how critical it is that a board do that, especially if you are planning in the future, because you have to know where you are financially in order to be able to prepare financially for what you want to do. And so you can do all the work in the world, and then if you don't have that financial dashboard in front of you, you may do all this work and then go, well, we have all these ideas, but we can't afford any of them. And so that financial dashboard to me is absolutely the most critical piece of that. That and the accreditation report, those are both really awesome resources that help you kind of get going on that process. And
it's amazing what you learn from that as well, because so many times we kind of, I know a lot of board members, and me, I'm guilty of this as well. If we just are handed a big stack of P&L statements and, a thick pack of financial reports, we may not have the aha eureka moments that a dashboard can provide. Absolutely. When it's visually depicted. My experience has been that when we have that visual depiction, you're able to look at 10 years of information all in one spot, mm-hmm. and look across the line. You're like, oh, wow, we really, are behind in this area, or wow, we're doing really well in this area. So yeah. To me, when I work with a school, having that piece is critical.
One other question, and you may want to discuss this at a different point, but James Culver is asking, can you discuss the benefits or drawbacks to conducting a strategic plan before an immediate self-study?
That's such a good question. I have an idea.
It's a great question, and I'm curious to what you think about that, because I think I know what I think about it.
Well, I'll answer it, and then you can answer it, and we'll see if we're completely in different places.
Right.
So I would say, James, it's a good question, and I've seen it done both ways. What I would not do is I would not rush into a strategic planning process if your accreditation visit is right around the corner. I wouldn't rush into that. So the challenge is part of being accredited means you've got a current strategic plan. So sometimes a school will realize, oh my gosh, we haven't had a strategic plan in 3 or 4 years, or longer, 10 years. We've got to have a strategic plan quick before the on-site visit team shows up. Not necessarily. It's important that you're in strategic conversations, but if the visit is about to happen, one of the things you're going to get is an accreditation report. And the information from that accreditation report may really help you in developing the next strategic plan. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a hard line in the sand, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I'm going to say if you're within 12 months of an accreditation visit, you may or may not want to do that right now. I don't know why I picked 12 months. I just feel like I need to give you some kind of concrete piece of information. But, if you're about to start the self-study, that means you're 1.5 years, 2 years away from the visit coming. And I don't know, you may want to wait. You may want to do the self-study, go through that process as part of the institutional review for your strategic plan. and then conduct the strategic plan after the accreditation visit. So, Mary Catherine, how would you answer that question? I don't know if I really answered this question or not.
No, I think you did. And yes, I 100% agree that for me, it makes no sense to try to jump in and do first of all, if you're in the middle of a self-study, if you're in that timing of the process, that's a lot of work
A whole lot of work,
already.
yeah.
And it's every constituency is involved in that process. So number one, it's a lot of work and you're going to wear out your people. But number two, it makes no sense to me to try to do that right before, because I want the information from the outside source to tell me what are the things that I'm not seeing. And so I think that the 12-month mark is a great mark. I think that's you're probably in that self-study process at that point, and you're gathering institutional information at that point. You're writing your self-study, and then once that's done, really what you're doing is you are creating, as you write your self-study, you're looking at industry trends, you're looking at institutional review, you're looking at a lot of that while you're doing your self-study anyway. You're doing surveys and getting information from your constituency. So it does make sense to me to wait and use that report as part of the process. I also have seen too many times where people try to rush into it just because there's an accreditation visit coming. And so what you end up with is a document that's not only not that deep, it's just not that helpful. It's just it's almost a box checking kind of document, and that's not what you're trying to do. So I'm with you. I would say if you're within 12 months, just wait.
I think that if you are a year out of self-study, that means you're 2 years away from a visit. And I don't know if that's, I think I'm okay with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I'm okay with that.
I agree.
I think that if you've just gone through an accreditation visit, I think that's a great time to do it. I'm working with a couple schools right now.
That's my favorite time to do it.
Yeah, because they've just finished the accreditation process, and so then they're just starting a strategic planning process. So they're able to take that data from the institutional review and really inform the strategic plan. And also by doing that, it's the gold standard of what accreditation is supposed to do in the first place, which is obviously accountability, but really making sure that the place is thinking strategically and executing on those strategic ideas.
Right.
So, so I guess I would say, 12 months out from a visit, maybe tap the brakes. More than 12 months out for a visit, probably okay. Immediately after the visit, I think great.
Right.
So hopefully that answers your question. Type another one in if you want to push back or if you want some clarification on that. So the industry trends, the institutional review, and then the last bit would be the constituency review. So what I mean by that is, what data, what information do we have about the people that we're serving, the families we're serving, that could inform our process? So specifically, we recommend that schools do some type of survey every year of their stakeholders. We have a handful of surveys that y'all can use for free on our website. We have templates for surveys for you to use as part of your self-study. You can use those totally for free, download those, amend them, change them however you want. We can conduct those surveys for you if you'd rather have a third party do it for you. But regardless, make sure you've got some survey data that really is informing not just what's going on in the industry, not just what's going on from our institutional review, but what are our people saying? What are our people saying that we do great? What are our people saying that, you know what, we can maybe get better at that? So
one thing that we did that I want to know your thoughts on, this was years ago, but I thought it was really successful, is we did have somebody from SAES actually come in and facilitate our survey, but we also had a team of parents that helped create, where you had the ability to do the survey online, or if you wanted to do it verbally with a volunteer, you could do that. So that and it created an opportunity for more people who didn't want to do something online. We got all those people that were willing, that wanted to have something to say, I wouldn't do this every year because I think it's a lot of labor. But in a strategic planning year, when you really want to try to get as much engagement from your parents as possible, the idea around having somebody, a third party that parents can actually come and sit down and talk to about the questions instead of just filling it out online, that
Yeah.
was really helpful. I don't know if that's still, if that's something that SAS is doing right now, but it was really helpful to us in those years.
Here's another great question. What's the latest trend in how frequently should we be conducting a strategic plan? And yeah, that's a great question among all the strategic planners that are out there. And I'm going to show you a range when we get to the very last slide, because some of the really progressive strategic planners are saying that the idea of a multi-year strategic plan is passe, and you shouldn't do multi-year strategic plans, but rather you should do kind of constant strategic planning at the board level. That's one extreme. The other extreme is 5 years, I think. That used to be the norm. The norm used to be every 5 years, do a strategic plan. What we're finding right now is the landscape is shifting so much that what you come up with as a vision today, 5 years from now, oh my gosh,
Not
everything's
even
changed.
there.
So what I'm seeing more of are 2 years and 3 year plans. 3 is probably the norm, but there's some strategic planners out there that would tell you 3 years is too long. So don't get too worked up about when you're doing this in connection with an accreditation plan. Do a 1 year plan and just constantly renew and review that. Most of my schools aren't quite ready for that. So I think that norm of what I'm saying are 2 and 3 year plans. What about you, MK?
Yeah, I feel I like it. I think 2 is a great number. Honestly, I do. It's a little bit labor intensive for a school to try to do it every year. Although I personally, I think that would be, it would be a great way to do it. It's just that we have so much of what we do our people that do this planning process are typically volunteers.
Right.
And so I'm not sure it's realistic to try to do. I like 2 years. I think 2 to 3 years at the most. I would say definitely not more than 3.
So you've just collected all your data. You've got a strategic task force that's put together. You've got a ton of really great data. Where do we go from there? Well, normally what happens next is a developing the plan's vision and goals. Now, this normally takes place within the context of either a one-day retreat, or I've seen it also done through a series of evening gatherings with the stakeholders. It's a little bit challenging to do this series of gatherings just because it's hard to get the same exact group to commit to 2 evenings or 3 evenings. But the flip side to that is some folks will tell me it's really hard to get a group of 20, 25 people that can all be there for 5 hours, 6 hours on a Saturday. So either approach works, but basically this step is done within the context of some type of focused retreat or focused meeting or meetings. And what we do is we assume that the mission statement has been reviewed and no additional changes are needed. Then what we try to do is identify what are the values that are represented by our mission. And using those values in our mission, we try to craft what is this plan's vision statement. And what I mean by that is, where do we want to be in 3 years or 2 years or however many years? From a concrete perspective, if that's our mission, if these are the values that we hold to be dear, what does wild success look like in this next chapter of the school's life, be it 2 years or be it 3 years? And then once that vision has been identified, we generally then see, okay, there's a gap or a bit of a delta between where we currently are and where we want to be. And so we then need to identify, well, what are the goals? What do we need to check off? What are our big goals we need to check off in order to move us from where we are currently to our vision for the next chapter of the school? So that's the work that takes place within the context of the retreat. And again, sometimes that's facilitated internally. I will share with you when we're towards the end of our time tonight a bunch of resources if you want to facilitate that internally, Or of course, we can help you with that or put you in touch with folks who can. But that's basically step 3. And then you move from that work back into the task force or the committee. And this is when the task force and the head really get together and figure out, okay, how are we going to achieve these goals? And basically we develop action plans for each goal. So here's an example. Let's say we've got our mission statement, we've got the values that we hold dear, we've got a vision, but in order for us to reach our vision, one of our areas is we need to increase non-tuition revenue. So then that would go from the data from the retreat into the task force, and that task force would then say, okay, if our goal is to increase non-tuition revenue or alternative streams of revenue, what can that action plan look like? For example, we may want to identify all possible alternative sources of revenue. Are there rentals we can explore? Are there summer programs maybe that we're not offering that we need to? Maybe extended care that we're not offering that we need to? What are some possible alternative sources of revenue? And then develop a strategic financial plan for how are we going to accomplish that? Because all of those things I've mentioned probably have some expenses aligned with them. If it's rentals, if we're renting the place out, that's great, but that means there's also going to be more wear and tear. If we're doing new summer programs, that's awesome, but we're going to have staff for the summer programs. Same with extended care. So what's the financial ramification of that? And then what about the staffing needs? What about the marketing needs? All those things. So basically, that's just an example of how we take a goal, and then within the committee, they're going to flesh that out and develop an action plan for each of those goals. So how many goals should you have? That's another frequently asked question. It depends on how long the scope of the plan is. For a 2 to 3 year plan, 3 or 4 pretty weighty, meaty goals are basically going to be all you can accomplish in 2 to 3 years. If it's a 1 year plan, you maybe want to just focus on one goal. If it's a 5 year plan, you probably can get away with 4 or 5. But the short answer of how many will depend on how long the plan is. Step 5 is scenario testing. So you've had your retreat, you've come up with great ideas, it's gone to the task force. The task force has taken these ideas and put action plans to each of those ideas. It now makes sense for us to stop and do some testing. Now, I say it makes sense to test the plan wisely with stakeholders. Depending on the content of that plan, you may not want to test it outside of the retreat group. For example, some of the strategies you may not want to be released to the public yet. So the plan hasn't been adopted, but the point is there needs to be some process to test whether or not the task force hit the mark from what came out of the retreat. So you can do it a couple of different ways. I've seen it done with focus groups where you invite a handful of people who were in the retreat to come back in for a conversation with the task force where they say, okay, here are the 4 goals we came up with. Here are the action plans that we've developed. Do you think that that is what we were talking about on that Saturday afternoon, or did we miss the mark? Hopefully they're going to say, yeah, that's exactly what we meant. If they don't, that's even better because you want to identify where the gaps are before you take this back to the board. Here is where I want to sing the praises of the curmudgeon. Test with a curmudgeon. Mm-hmm. Every community has a curmudgeon. Every community has someone who is constantly pushing back. I think those people don't get the kind of credit they deserve. Lots of times we try to avoid those folks. I would argue that's exactly who you want to put the work of the task force in front of to really, really beat it up to make sure that the task force didn't get, didn't get kind of blown off course in their conversations, because that happens as well. This is also critically important if a capital campaign is in your future. Frequently, what will come out of a strategic plan is the need for a capital campaign. Significant players in that capital campaign should be involved in the scenario testing piece before it gets adopted by the board, if that makes sense. Mary Catherine, do you have any comments about that?
Well, I'm just thinking about, I love that you said invite the curmudgeons, because
They don't get nearly as much credit as
no,
they should.
They don't. And I can just think of a number of people who are my no people. And the reason that is important is because many times those of us who are in leadership positions, whether we're heads of schools or we're clergy or we're visionaries, and we have great ideas and we think that they're fantastic, and we don't like to think about the downside. And so I think there's got to be, not only in the scenario testing, these people that are maybe your no people, or you're questioning, or your what if, or have you considered, those people need to be sure, you need to be sure that they're in your retreat as well, because because they can push back there too. And we don't want to have a bunch of dreamers coming up with the plan, and then or people that are not detail people. My favorite is when I would throw out an idea and someone would say, well, now how can I ask how that's gonna how are we gonna pay for that, or how are we gonna make that happen in 2 days? Because I think that scenario testing, I love that. And I actually do like the idea of the focus groups more than I like the idea of maybe going back to the whole group. The focus groups are important because sometimes in a big group, there are people who won't talk. But if you get them in a small focus group, they will, and they have important things to say. So yeah, I think this is a really critical piece.
And sometimes I've seen this done one-on-one too. I've seen, in a smaller community, if we want to maybe test it with 5 folks, I've seen this one-on-one. Maybe the head has a sit down with a stakeholder, or the chair of the task force will have a sit down with the stakeholder. I've seen it done that way too. It's a little more efficient to do it as a focus group with like 4 or 5 participants and the whole committee. But however you do it is fine. But the important thing is, don't just make the assumption that the task force hit the nail on the head.
Right.
Because when that task force is together, they're going to be doing some work, and it's not impossible for them to get a little bit off course from what was being said in the retreat, if that makes sense.
Right.
So we've tested the scenario. We feel really, really good. The next step is to take it to the board. So we're back in the board lane, the top lane on that 3-lane chart that we started with this evening. And now it's time to take the work of the task force that's been tested and bring it back to the board for adoption. Two pieces of advice for boards at this stage. One, don't get too sucked into the minutia of the action plans. My recommendation is that the board adoption is not the time to necessarily rewrite all of the action plans. So just be careful. Obviously give feedback, tweak as necessary, but at the core, the board needs to be making sure that the goals are properly aligned, the action plans are basically where they need to be. You're gonna have to tweak and you're gonna have to amend as you execute, but don't get too sucked into the minutia of the action plans. Don't let that hold up the adoption of the plan. Also, prioritization is key. So a healthy strategic plan should also have timelines for each action goal. And what I really suggest boards to do is look at the prioritization. Is the order correct? Also, is the strategic financial plan, or the how are we going to pay for it, has that been accounted for? If you don't, then all you have is a really cool wish list that has no possibility of being implemented. And so the plan that comes to the board obviously needs to have the goals, obviously needs to have the action plans, but also needs to have the fiscal implications of all of those things, along with estimated start time and finish time, so the board will know what the budget ramifications are for all of those things. And I've seen that done a couple of different ways. I've seen it done as a separate strategic financial plan that accompanies the financial plan, or I've seen it done within the context of the plan. Do you have a preference, Mary Catherine, on how that's done? I've seen it done both ways. My only preference is that the conversation is taking place as part of the whole strategic planning process.
Yeah, I don't think that I have an opinion either way on that. I think it just has to be you have to have that conversation.
What I know is wrong is if you just show up to the board with this awesome goals, awesome action plan, and no understanding of how much it's going to cost, and
Right.
also no understanding of, which we are you saying we've got to do all this now? In a multi-year plan, there needs to be some thought about what do we do now? What do we do in 6 months? What do we do a year
Right.
from now, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't have to be, on February 19th, we do this, but it should be summer of 2021 is the deadline for this. Christmas 2022 is the deadline for this, et cetera, et cetera. Just something that shows a prioritization conversation is taking place. What happens next? So the board has adopted the strategic plan. Step number 7 is what all of our Enneagram 7s love, the celebrate and communicate phase. So you have just done a huge amount of heavy lifting, and it's time to celebrate, and it's time to communicate this. Share it with your community, share it with your stakeholders. I think from a marketing perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense to spend a little bit of money and develop some type of marketing piece where you share the strategic plan with your community. That doesn't mean you have to print the moves chart that has, all the specific steps that we're going to accomplish. You don't have to necessarily do that. But what I do like to see is, at the minimum, a narrative that talks about what the process was, that highlights that we had stakeholder involvement from every possible area of the school, and then in a narrative way explains what the 4 or 3 goals are going to be and how that's going to translate into a phenomenal experience for our kids.
Yeah, I think that's really, that's really important, partially because the people that were involved in the planning process in the beginning, all the stakeholders that we asked surveys of, one of the things that's most irritating, I think, to people is when you ask their opinion, you give them a survey, and then nothing ever comes out of it. They don't ever know anything about how that ended. And so this step 7, not only is it important from a marketing perspective to kind of sell your school, it's important to close the loop on your communication with your constituencies to make sure that they know that you actually did the work that you said you were going to do. And as a board, that we're not only, we've taken all of the pieces, we put it together, here's the plan, and now it's our job to get it done. And so I think that makes the board, it just gives them credibility.
Yeah, I think it's critically important. A great marketing piece for your school, great way to generate some positive buzz, really, really important. And then continue, just, don't stop there. Continue with periodic reports from the board to the community, be it from the president of the board and their, maybe in a newsletter piece or a little video that you'd put on the website, however you want to do it. But periodically update the community on this awesome strategic plan. And we've accomplished this, that means we get to move on to this, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Hey, real quick, David, so James Culver wanted to make sure that he understood the cost or should be quantified at an initiative level, either separately or within the plan, and presented back before the board approves the plan. So what he's asking, I think, is to make sure that before the plan is approved, that the costs are put in front of the board, or
to the extent possible. Yeah,
that?
I mean, to the extent possible, I think there needs to be some kind of conversation. One of the ways you can do this, because it's going to be, depending on the specific goals at the adoption phase, it's going to be a little bit tricky to be able to present to the board exactly what the cost is of a particular thing. But one of the ways I've seen boards handle this is to put a range in the strategic plan moves chart of, $1 sign means $1,000. $2 signs means $1,000 to $10,000. $3 signs means, $10,000 to $25,000. Providing some kind of expectation. If you can get more detailed, then I think that's great. If you're able to present exact costs, I think that's great. But for example, one of your strategic plan components may be adding a position. That's not uncommon. In year 2, we're going to add, I don't know, a marketing professional. We're going to contract out for some marketing expenses. So it's going to be difficult, particularly 2 years out, to know exactly what you're going to spend on that. So I would try to have some type of conversation about what we're going to call, what it's going to cost for us to do that. The exception is if the strategic plan is going to have some fiscal impact on the immediate next year, then I think that does need to be fleshed out, in my opinion, 100%.
Yeah, something like if the strategic plan had if you finished it and you had in the summer, you were going to do some some of the things you have deferred maintenance on, things like that, where maybe it's going to cost you $10,000 or $15,000 of deferred maintenance that you have to get done. That should be more specific because it's a close timeline.
Yeah, I mean, the goal of having these conversations is just so the board will be able to know what's coming down,
right?
What's coming down the line, in year 2, in year 3, because part of the strategic financial plan may be in year 2 we're going to hire this position, but in year 1 we're going to try to save X dollars so that when we do have to add this position next year, we'll have some of the money already saved. So I've seen it done that way too. So it's kind of hard to quantify it exactly depending on the timing and the specific project. But I think the short answer would be, as much as you can, bring that into that initial adoption. Does that help a little bit?
I think that's right.
Yeah, the multi-dollar signs, that's helpful. Now again, that's great at the adoption phase. 6 months from now or a year from now, we've got to have a little more information then.
Yeah, that's probably not good for a long-term strategic plan.
yeah, but that's a place to start at least, so that if the treasurer sees, okay, wow, I've got three $3 sign projects that we're going to have to figure out how to pay for in year 2, we got to start talking about that now. So right. That's kind of a way to kind of thread the needle on that, I think. The final step is just implementation. Kind of we're getting into that right now and talking about how we're going to pay for this. But my favorite quote regarding implementation is, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. So even if you've got this great, awesome plan, now you've got to execute on it and make sure you're pushing forward and asking those kinds of questions about, hey, okay, we adopted this plan that had $3 signs by it. What does that mean for tuition next year? Et cetera, et cetera. So each quarter, at least, I recommend the board carves some time to really talk about the strategic plan. I like for a school, at least once a quarter, to go to a consent calendar, which means that all of the regular reports are sent out ahead of time and are basically approved with one vote, unless there's something that someone really wants to dig into. And then that board time is spent pulling out the strategic plan and talking about, where are we on this? Where are we on this? What about the fiscal impact of this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's step 8, implementation. And then before you know it, you're going to be right back at the top of the cycle again. So we're going to go back to some questions here in a little bit, but let me share one more slide about some resources. So depending on how you want to do this, some of these resources may make a lot of sense for you. So your SAES resources I'd like to highlight, we've got a 1-pager or maybe a 2-pager on setting the strategic direction of your school in our document library. So that's a document you can take a look at if you want to hear some additional thoughts on how to set the strategic direction of your school and what that looks like. Another great resource are our vital signs. I mentioned that in the benchmarking process. That's a document in our document library you can access. Those are just things that we believe all strong schools share in common. Great document to look at before you're going into strategic planning process, because you can kind of assess, oh, wow, we're doing great on that. We're doing great on that. We're doing great on that. This is an area we really need to work on. So that's a great document to use to have strategic conversations. I mentioned our surveys. All of our surveys are free to download. Use those as you're gathering data, and then we can administer those for you for a fee if you'd rather us just do the whole thing. And then, of course, facilitation services. If the desire is to have someone come in and facilitate some of this work for you, then that's a service that we provide on a fee basis, depending on how much support you'd like to have in this area. A couple of books I'd like to recommend. These are especially important if you're thinking about facilitating the plan internally. So the first is the NAIS Trustee Handbook. National Association of Independent Schools, they have a website with a bookstore. All these resources are available on their website. So the Trustee Handbook does a great job of talking about strategic thinking. They have a strategic process book that goes through all of these steps in great detail, with some testimonials from different people. If you'd like to craft your strategic design process and facilitate it, that's a great resource. I mentioned Stephanie Rogan before. She has a book that's called Creating Schools That Thrive, a Blueprint for Strategy. I think this is a great resource if you want to facilitate internally. Her approach makes a lot of sense. Mary Catherine and I have both been using that material with schools. It has activities, it has different suggestions on how to do that work that I highlighted in the retreat. And that's a great resource if you want to use, if you want to facilitate the process yourself or internally. And then the last book is a guy, David LaPiana. He is from the camp where I mentioned some strategic planners think that writing a formal strategic plan is passé. So his approach is to work with our boards to get away from creating a multi-year plan and really getting into the habit of creating an annual strategic plan from the board level, and that's how we're going to address these things. A lot of my schools, that's I don't have a lot of schools that are using that resource, but I will tell you it's very compelling. I like that book a lot. And if you really are wanting to maybe get away from a multi-year strategic plan and really bring that board into a constant level of strategic thinking, I think that is that's as good a resource as I've seen on that topic. Mary Catherine, any other resources or ideas that you want to share?
I don't think so. That Stephanie Rogan is so far is my favorite. I just think it's an innovative book, and it would be helpful if you're going to try to do it internally.
It's very
Although the only thing I would say, and this is, this in some ways is a plug for SAES, but it's a plug also for the idea around having it facilitated. I really do think that that you mine data better when you've got somebody from the outside asking the questions. I think that you get better data when someone besides the head of school or the board chair is leading the conversation.
Yeah.
You just do. And so I really do believe that the best way to do it is having a facilitator that's a third party, that's just kind of an uninterested person to gather the data. People just talk more, and it's just better, I think. That's just, that's just my opinion.
I agree, and I agree as someone who has self-facilitated for his organization. The first strategic plan our association created under my time as executive director, that was a plan that I facilitated. And looking back on that, the upside is that it really helps the head of school or the executive director fully learn the community. The downside is it's very difficult to facilitate and also be in the conversation, if that makes sense. And so we're about to do a new strategic plan for our association. I am going to bring in someone to facilitate, just because I feel like my contribution is best not as the facilitator, but as a stakeholder in the conversation, being fully fully engaged. It's hard to do both, but if you want to try to do both, use some of those resources, because
Yeah, I agree.
that will really help.